Welcome back to the Forgotten Ancient Civilizations Iceberg. If you've gotten this far into the series, I assume that you know what the gist of the iceberg is, so I'm only going to tell you that today we're going to be exploring 4 different, equally fascinating civilizations from across the ancient Americas. I know 4 doesn't sound like a lot, especially for this runtime, but I've made sure to cover each of these civilizations in more depth than ever before. So without further ado, let's begin with the Chimu. The Chimu Empire existed along the northern coast of Peru in the same general area as the Moche, which you might remember from Part 3. It began around 850 or 900 AD and ended with its conquest by the next great Andean imperial power, the Inca, around 1470. Its founding ruler, named Kanamu, was said to have been born out of a golden egg in that he came from the sea on a log raft after he'd been sent to govern the Chimu by some great lord from across the sea. The Chimu also had a myth that royals and noblemen came from golden eggs, noble women came from silver eggs, and that all the plebs came from copper eggs. So they were a very, very intensely hierarchical society, which is reflected in their obsession with depicting their rulers with their insanely elaborate headdresses, and even the very layout of its great capital, Chan Chan. Which is just an absolutely fantastic name, eh? It's located right next to the ocean and 4 miles north of the mouth of the Moche River, basically within the modern city of Trujillo. It also happens to be right next to the Moche's greatest center, named Moche, of course, with its great adobe Waka pyramids. At its height, Chan Chan might have had a peak population of about 36,000 to 40,000 people, and covered 20 square kilometers, or over 7 square miles. Its population included around 26,000 male and female artisans who lived there to mass-produce luxury goods for the elites, but a lot of them were forced to live there after being captured from conquered territory, like the Lambayeque Valley, which had a ton of really great metalsmiths, who made masterpieces like this famous Tumi knife, which is like the first thing that pops into my head when I think of pre-Columbian Peru. Ironically, when the Inca conquered the Chimu artisans and a lot of their art were themselves forcefully relocated to Cuzco. And because Chan Chan receives less than 1/10 of an inch of rain per year, despite being right next to the ocean, all these people had to subsist off of an extensive irrigation system bringing snowmelt from the Andes to the city's big reservoirs. And even beyond that, Chan Chan wasn't a normal city, because as you can see, its main features are these monumental adobe brick palace compounds, and the city completely revolved around them. Personally, I think they have a really striking appearance since they erode pretty easily, so they sort of look like they're all melting. They were also deliberately filled with a bunch of these holes to help air circulate through them, and they're ornamented with geometric patterns and depictions of sea life, possibly meant to imitate hanging textiles. Around 11 different rectangular royal palaces were built at Chan Chan, and they're all labyrinthine in their complexity, quite literally, because there was only ever one way to get in or out of them. Plus, they have massive 10 to 12 meter high double exterior walls meant to keep all the riffraff out. So they're like mini cities all into themselves, which is why they're now called ciudadelas. Sorry for butchering that. And these ciudadelas all feature rather cramped U-shaped rooms, which are now thought to be the throne rooms of Chimu kings, as well as open plazas for feasts and ceremonies. It's likely that each palace corresponds to each Chimu ruler, because the number of known Chimu rulers and the number of ciudadelas does sorta match, and it's possible that after an individual ruler's demise, their palace compound became an institution dedicated to them, and their successor had to build a whole new palace of their own, because they only inherited their predecessor's title, not their property. It sounds like a rough deal, but at the center of each of these ciudadelas, there are big burial platforms where the dead king's mummy was probably placed. So I'm sure the next king probably didn't want to have to live around a corpse. And there are even more of these burial platforms outside of the compound's walls, like Waka Toledo on the east side of the city, as well as Waka Takainamo, where an almost perfectly preserved wooden Chimu sculpture was discovered in 2022, and Waka del Dragon, which bears reliefs of dragons underneath rainbows, oddly enough. As the empire grew, the size of the palaces grew too. The largest, called the Grand Chimu, is 220,000 square meters, and it sits at the northern edge of Chanchan. It's also known as An, and in 2018, 19 striking wooden statues of guards wearing clay masks and shown with objects like scepters, shields, and even trophy heads were found in its entrance corridor. But do you know what's as secure as this palace was? That's right, the sponsor of this video, Private Internet Access VPN. It's the most reliable, transparent, and easy to use VPN app around. A VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that's able to hide your IP address and shields your internet connection and private information through an encrypted tunnel, stopping the many people willing to exploit it from doing so, which you're most at risk of when you connect to public Wi-Fi networks. But Private Internet Access, which is available on all platforms, protects your personal data by encrypting your internet connection through their world-class server infrastructure, making your valuable personal information entirely off limits. Private Internet Access also happens to be the world's most transparent VPN provider, and it never records or stores its users' data. But my favorite feature of PIA is that it also allows you to access region-restricted content from all over the world, because it works with all major streaming services and connects to servers in 91 different countries. So because I've been obsessing over various places in Latin America, I decided to head on down to Peruvian Netflix, and it turns out that they have some pretty interesting stuff. So join the 30 million people like me who use private internet access today, which you can do in seconds with the link in the description below. Using that link, you can get it for 83% off, so it'll only cost you $2.03 a month. And on top of that, you'll get 4 months of free service completely for free. And on top of that, getting a single subscription allows you to protect an unlimited number of devices simultaneously. And even if it somehow doesn't suit you, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. But now let's return to the Chimu. But this is just a small glimpse into the military might which made the Chimu Empire possible. Between the years 900 and 1050 AD, the Chimu state had slowly expanded to control the valleys neighboring Chanchan, like the Viru Valley and the Chicama Valley. And after 1130, they started expanding pretty aggressively beyond that. They conquered the Hecatepeque Valley around 1200, and the Lambayeque Valley, home to all those talented metalsmiths, around 1370. The empire enjoyed its height around the mid-15th century, when it spanned some 1,300 kilometers or 600 miles from Tumbes around the Peru-Ecuador border to nearly as far south as Lima around the Patavilca River, where they built the imposing fortress of Paramonga. The Chimu built some other regional administrative centers like it, such as Farfan in the Hecatepeque Valley and Manchan in the Casma Valley. And there are some other sites close to Chanchan like El Milagro de San Jose and Quebrado del Oso, both of which feature palatial compounds similar to those found in Chanchan. To accommodate the ever-growing amount of tribute the Chimu ruler was getting, the size of the storerooms in Chanchan ciudadelas also grew, and interestingly, the reliefs decorating them might indicate what was stored within them. But unlike the Incas, their empire wasn't all-encompassing, and the Chimu had various rivals, like various Aymara kingdoms, thriving on the west coast of Lake Titicaca, and the kingdom of Cajamarca in the highlands to their northeast. But it was another of their rivals that spelled their downfall. The same century that witnessed the Chimu Empire's height also witnessed its demise, because around 1470, the Inca ruler Tupac Yupanqui captured the last Chimu ruler, Minchanchaman, and carried him and all his artists off to Cuzco. But the Chimu did wind up exerting a lot of influence over the Inca. Like the Chimu, the Incas organized state-run compounds of foreign artists, and their rulers, the Incas, only inherited their predecessor's title, not his property. Chimu art even stylistically influenced Inca art, And we know the names of some of the Chimu rulers, unlike the vast majority of other pre-Columbian states in Peru, because the Inca remembered them and passed that info along to Spanish chroniclers. But unfortunately, both the Chimu and the Inca both shared a pretty horrible practice: child sacrifice. The area around Chan Chan witnessed multiple state-organized mass sacrifice events from 1050 into the Inca period, the remains of which have been found at 3 sites about 6 miles north of Chan Chan: Huanchaquito, Las Lamas, Pampa la Cruz, and El Pollo. The skeletons of 451 sacrificed children were found, along with the skeletons of 36 sacrificed adults, mainly women, and 620 sacrificed llamas. Oxygen isotope analysis of the human remains showed that the majority of those sacrificed came from outside the Moche Valley, so maybe this was the Chimu's way of forcing their conquered subjects to buy into their twisted worldview. Almost all of these people were killed in the exact same way, with a cut to the chest, which suggests that their hearts were removed. Oddly, none of the victims seem to have suffered from malnutrition. A Spanish friar, Antonio de la Calancha, wrote that the Chimu conducted child sacrifice during lunar eclipses, but that's basically the only textual information we have about this. And unlike the Moche, they never depicted human sacrifice in their art, so we'll probably never know why these terrible events happened. So there definitely was a darker side to the Chimu Empire. So let's move on to another part of South America, Colombia, to cover the Muisca. Colombia has been home to a plethora of really amazing civilizations, which left behind some truly amazing stuff. These different civilizations are pretty obscure outside of Colombia today, but there's one whose memory has stood the test of time because it's inextricably linked with South America's most iconic legend, El Dorado. No, not that El Dorado, this El Dorado. They're also the ancestors of millions of modern Colombians and were a critical component of the country's history. I'm of course referring to the Muisca, also sometimes referred to as the Chibchas, who occupied the area around Colombia's modern capital, Bogotá, which gets its name from the Muisca. This comprises the modern Colombian provinces of Cundinamarca, Boyacá, and Santander. Since these provinces straddle the Cordillera Oriental, the easternmost of the 3 branches of the Andes running through Colombia, the Muisca mainly had to live at 2,000 to 3,000 meters above sea level. They're one of a number of Chibchan-speaking peoples spread across southern Central America and Colombia, who were all really fond of gold, as well as a gold-copper alloy called tumbaga, and the Muisca were no exception to that. They were masters of creating distinctively flat and unpolished golden figurines of people and animals with elaborate surface details added in thin gold thread, which were mainly cast using the lost wax method. There wasn't actually any gold in their territory though, so they went out of their way to barter what they did have, like emeralds, salt, and their surplus maize crops to acquire it from their neighbors. These golden figurines are rarely found in Muisca tombs because most of them were actually votive offerings, known as tunjos, made to be left at various sacred natural features like caves, fields, mountaintops, and lakes, the most famous among them being Lake Guatavita, the birthplace of the legend of El Dorado, which we'll get to in a sec. But let's delve into their known gold first, like those tunjos. My favorite type of them are these ones in the shape of snakes with whiskers, probably made because the Muisca believed that their mythical ancestors lived as snakes in the lakes where these tunjos were offered. If that sort of reminds you of the Loch Ness Monster, you wouldn't be alone, because there's actually a Colombian equivalent to Nessie called the Monster of Lake Tota. The Muisca also created lavishly decorated golden snuff trays, which they used to inhale the psychoactive crushed seeds of the yopo tree, which they used to divine the future and what they thought the sun, their main god, had in store for them. The Muisca even made tunjos depicting people using these snuff trays, along with other little narrative scenes like golden warriors clutching trophy heads, mothers carrying babies, and most famously this beautiful little raft now housed in Bogotá's Museo del Oro, the main depository of Muisca gold. It was found in a cave south of Bogotá near the town of Pasca in 1969 in a pot with other tunjos, and it's thought to represent the annual ceremony held on Lake Guatavita, which led to the creation of the El Dorado myth. The chief of the town next to Lake Guatavita, which had the same name, Guatavita, and was renowned for its master goldsmiths, would annually cover themselves head to toe in gold dust, raft out to the exact center of the lake, and then throw in a bunch of precious offerings. And then after he'd done that, he'd jump into the lake to wash off all the gold dust on him. So as you might have heard before in passing, as a fun fact, the legend of El Dorado was actually initially about a guy covered in gold, not a city covered in gold. Tons of other gold, emerald, and ceramic offerings were dumped into the lake because people other than the ruler threw however many offerings they could afford into it, and the Spanish knew this, so at the end of the 16th century they cut a huge notch into the mountain besides the lake in an attempt at draining it, which you can still clearly see today, which did actually allow them to plunder the treasure on the edges of the lake bed, including an emerald the size of a hen's egg, but the middle remains pretty much untouched. Countless lives and fortunes have been lost trying to get that gold, but it's been off limits to such treasure hunting since 1965, when the lake was declared a cultural heritage site. But besides all their gold, the other thing that the Muisca are known for is the complexity of their society, which led to the creation of massive chiefdoms, which were on the threshold of statehood, as one author put it, and they might have even been right on the cusp of forming a great empire like the Aztec Empire or the Inca Empire right before the Spanish arrived. The Muisca had the highest population densities and the clearest social hierarchies in the Chibchan world, even though they only adopted such marked hierarchies as late as the year 800, despite the fact that they'd been farming their main dietary staple, corn, since 1000 BC. The specifics of Muisca chronology are disputed and pretty vague, but the Muisca period proper was preceded by something called the Herrera period, which is generally dated to between 800 BC and 800 AD. That's when ceramics were first introduced, agriculture intensified, and the population increased. But the Muisca period itself is only said to have begun anywhere between 600 and 1000 AD. Some have theorized that the Muisca came to Colombia from as far away as Central America or Lake Titicaca, and some wackos have even theorized that they came from Japan, but they're probably the people that have essentially always been there. The Muisca period itself was when the Muisca formed the 5 different polities which the Spanish eventually encountered, but only 3 are really that notable. The most powerful of these was ruled from the town of Bacata, also known as Muacueta, by a ruler known as the Zipa. Bacata gives its name to Bogota, but it was actually closer to the modern town of Funza. The Zipa's main rival was a ruler called the Zaque, based out of the town of Tunja, and he had close relations with the Muisca's spiritual leader called the Araka, based around a temple at Sogamoso, also known as Suamax or Sugamukchi, which was filled with gold and emeralds, and whose priests burned it down right before the Spaniards would have captured it. But we only really know about what the Zipa's realm was like, so let me get into that a bit. The Zipa was an all-powerful despot who got the throne by being the eldest son of the former Zipa's eldest sister, and he was treated with extreme deference. He also enjoyed a harem, apparently consisting of several hundred different women and various pleasure houses. But he did actually have to abide by a law code, and he relied on a bunch of subjugated vassal chiefs and district leaders called usakes, who owed allegiance to no one but the Zipa. Strangely, the mummies of these usakes would be paraded around during battle to boost morale, and yeah, the Muisca had their own mummies. The Zipa also relied on a bunch of other government employees like tax collectors, judges, messengers, and even professional elite military commanders called guechas. They used spear throwers, clubs, slings, and sometimes even hired foreign archers who used poison arrows, so you wouldn't want to get on their bad side. You also probably didn't want to get on the bad side of any tax collectors either, because tax evasion was punished by being kept with a wildcat or a bear until you agreed to pay up. The Zipa also maintained a proper cobblestone road network, and markets were routinely held. Commerce at these markets may have been conducted with small clay tokens and even gold discs, so in a way the Muisca kind of independently invented coinage. But unfortunately there was a much darker side to Muisca society, since they also performed human sacrifice, involving captured war captives, slaves, and unfortunately even small children. Boys from the Muisca's eternal enemy, called the Panches, were sold at high prices to Muisca chiefs, who would initially treat them with great respect because they were seen as being ritual intermediaries between the earth and the sun, and they were thought to be able to speak to the sun through mournful songs. But when they reached puberty, they were murdered, and these sacrifices were carried out in a pretty horrific way. The victim was tied to some kind of basket or cage on top of a high pole and then shot through with darts or arrows. Their blood would be collected at the base of the pole with saucers to then be offered up to the gods at a sanctuary. And even worse, it's possible that these sacrifices continued even after the Spanish conquest, which we should probably get into now. Oddly enough, it has a lot of weird parallels with the earlier conquest of the Aztec Empire. It was led by a Spanish lawyer turned soldier named Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. He first reached Muisca territory with only 166 men in April of 1537, after Mexico and Peru had been conquered and Spanish settlements had already been set up in northern Colombia along the Atlantic coast. In fact, the whole point of his expedition there was basically to set up a land route between the Atlantic and Peru. Within a year, he had conquered both Bogota and Tunja, but in a weird parallel with the Aztec conquest, the inhabitants of Bogota forced the Spaniards to abandon it after their old leader died, and they installed a new, more ferocious one named Sagipa in either 1537 or early 1538. Like how Moctezuma had been replaced by Cuauhtémoc up in Mexico. But then, in a complete turn of events that would make M. Night Shyamalan proud, the Spanish and the Muisca under Sagipa then teamed up to fight a huge battle involving over 12,000 Muisca men against the Muisca's arch-enemy, the potentially cannibalistic Panches, called the Battle of Tocarima. But then right afterwards, de Quesada tortured Sagipa in an attempt at getting him to reveal where his hidden treasure was, but to no avail, because he was killed in the process, which sort of reminds me of how Cortez tortured Cuauhtémoc to get to his hidden gold. And it's also eerily similar to the unfortunate fate of another indigenous emperor we'll be covering later in the video. De Quesada also founded Bogota, the modern city, on August 6th, 1538, and he established the new kingdom of Granada along with it. The next year, his brother Hernan, who'd been left in charge of the colony, killed the last Zaque, Achamin, slaughtered a bunch of other chiefs, and brutally suppressed guerrilla uprisings, which continued up until 1541. The Muisca were then consigned to encomiendas as virtual slaves, but by 1549, the encomienda system was replaced by a type of reservation system called the reducción, which involved gathering natives into settlements in or near colonial towns. The Muisca language became extinct by the 18th century, but they did maintain the system of matrilineal inheritance in the Usaques all throughout the colonial period. As late as 1781, there was a rebellion led by a descendant of the Zipas named Ambrosio Pisco, who was declared king of Bogota, and Muisca salt miners at Nemonzon claimed ownership of their ancestral mines, but this revolt was quickly crushed. By the late 19th century, so much ethnic intermixing had occurred that the Muiscas ceased to be discernibly Muisca and just became thoroughly assimilated Colombian mestizos. Colombia has a much more uniform mestizo makeup than other South American countries like Bolivia and Peru, which have more pronounced ethnic and linguistic divides. But that isn't the case for the entire country, as we'll see later on. There are still around 14,000 people who identify purely as Muisca, but there are millions of Colombian mestizos with partial Muisca ancestry. I would like to give an extra special thank you to my Colombian friend Sarah for helping me get some of the shots for this video, and her generous father Don Martin, who accommodated my family and I in Colombia for over a week. Anyways, before we move on, I should probably tell you about the most important and only really substantial Muisca archaeological site, which has a pretty great name, El Infiernito, which means the little hell, because the Spanish thought it was used for devil worship. It's in Boyaca, north of Bogota, and its main features are 2 rows of 36 standing stone. They cast specific shadows at specific times of the year and would have marked solstices and equinoxes. You know, the typical shebang. Also, apparently they run precisely east-west, which couldn't have been done without a lot of astronomical knowledge. They also maybe could have been used to predict eclipses. Oh, also, there are 30 other stone columns, almost too obviously in the shape of phalluses, which were likely involved in what else but earth fertility rituals. There are lots of other Muisca sites with similar monoliths like Tunja, Ramiriqui, Tibana, Paz de Rio, etc., but this is the best preserved one. It also reminds me a lot of El Caño in Panama, which shares these same sort of monoliths and earthen mounds. El Infiernito also features this strange underground shrine or tomb. Radiocarbon dating of burnt offerings found at the site are from the 1st millennium BC, but they're as old as the 10th century BC. So this place was being used for a long, long time. So let's move further north up the Americas to cover the Tarascans. The Tarascan Empire, more appropriately known as the Purupecha Empire, was sorta the Mesoamerican equivalent of the Chimu, minus all the mass child sacrifice, because it was the second largest empire in its region after a better known one, in this case, the Aztec Empire. But unlike the Chimu Empire, which was snuffed out by the Incas, the Purupecha Empire was never conquered by the Aztecs, despite their best efforts, and it actually outlasted them, but only by a few years. The Purupecha Empire covered between 65,000 and over 75,000 square kilometers, and although it was centered around the modern Mexican state of Michoacan, and more specifically around Mexico's highest lake, Lake Pátzcuaro, it also expanded into parts of Guerrero, Colima, Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Querétaro. The empire was ruled by a priest king with supposedly divine ancestry called either the Kazanki or the Arecha, and all of them came from a dynasty known as the Wanakaze or Wakusecha dynasty, which wasn't actually fully Purupecha in origin. At the empire's height, the Kazanki ruled from a capital which somehow has an even better name than Chan Chan, called Sinsun-san, which sits along the northeastern arm of Lake Pátzcuaro. It was a great sprawling city founded at latest by 1000 AD, and at its height it was home to between 25 and 35,000 people. It was divvied up into 4 districts for 4 different classes, which sounds like the premise of some crappy YA dystopian novel, I know, but it was real. It included the upper elite, including the royals, the lower elite, commoners, and foreigners. The city's most standout feature by far are these 5 towering keyhole-shaped structures called yakatas, which all sit on an enormous platform, which sort of makes them look like the studs of a huge Lego brick. They were probably used as both burial places for the empire's rulers and as temples devoted to the local wind god. There's also a bit of a darker side to them too, because when an important noble or ruler died, they customarily took a number of women and servants with them, and mutilated bones have been found around these yakatas. The Kazanki's palace was nearby, and it must have been pretty sick, minus all the sacrifice, when he died, because apparently there was a royal zoo in it, which more than makes up for it. Kidding. The city was also home to excellent metalworkers and craftsmen organized into different guilds, who used the copper found in Michoacan to make textiles adorned with little bells on them, along with metal weapons that gave their army a leg up over the Aztecs. And they also had access to silver and gold taken as tribute from the empire's frontiers, in Jalisco and Guerrero, respectively. The Purupecha were also fond of the sort of Chacmul statues Central Mexicans and the people they influenced really liked, although unfortunately they were probably also used in human sacrifice. But they also made tons of stone statues of coyotes for some reason. Most of these are understandably in Mexico, but if you happen to be in LA, you can actually spot one of these upstairs in the LA County Natural History Museum. Despite the empire's huge size, it had a refined administrative system employing a wide variety of officials, even including professional soldiers like the Muisca, and lucrative public offices were available to most of society. It's even possible that the Purupecha Empire was the most centralized state in Mesoamerica in its time, even one-upping the Aztecs, who they maintained a fierce rivalry with. They created a chain of fortified cities along the border they shared with the Aztecs, which was manned by tributary peoples like the Otomi and the Matlotzinca. This includes cities like Taxamaroa, modern Ciudad Hidalgo, and San Felipe de los Alzati, which has the highest pyramid in Michoacan. The Aztecs also maintained a buffer zone between themselves and the Purupecha, which included the city of Calixtlahuaca, which you might remember from the Out of Place Artifacts series, because in it we covered a supposedly Roman statuette head found there. The Purupecha Empire also had its own spy network and even gave land grants to Nahua people related to the Aztecs, who nonetheless fled from the Aztec Empire's expansion and helped in the fight against them. And even though the Aztecs never actually conquered Michoacan, Michoacan is an Aztec name which refers to how fond the Purupecha are of fishing, because it roughly translates as the place of fishers or place of the masters of fish. But it's possible that the Purupecha themselves may have only made up 10% of the empire's population, which might have encompassed as many as 1 million people. But the Purupecha are pretty interesting because they speak a very distinct language isolate, not related to any other Mesoamerican language, and Purupecha translates as the latecomers or the recent arrivals, which has caused a lot of debate about their origins. It might be connected to the Zuni language of the American Southwest, but some have theorized that it's connected to the Chibchan languages, like the ones spoken by the Muisca, or even Quechua from Peru. So it's been speculated that the Purupecha come from South America, which we'll get to in a sec. What we do know is that the dynasty that ruled the empire, the Huacusecha dynasty, was started by nomadic Chichimec hunter-gatherers that came from the same place as the Aztecs, somewhere in the deserts of northern Mexico or even the American Southwest, which was known as the Seven Caves of Chico-Moztoc. The Huacusecha also claimed descent from their fire and sun god Curiaqueri. Sometime between the late 12th and early 14th centuries, they entered Michoacan under a guy named Heredi Thicatame, possibly as a result of the decline of the Toltecs. Eventually, they made their way to Lake Pátzcuaro, where an identifiable Purupecha culture had existed since at least the late pre-classic period, around 2,000 years ago, which itself was probably descended from the Chupacuaro culture, best known for making these neat little ceramic figurines. The Purupecha's greatest cultural hero, named Taria Kuri, was both Purupecha and Chichimec, since his father was a Chichimec leader and his mother was the daughter of the lord of the island of Jaraquaro, whose people worshipped the moon and underworld goddess Zaratanga. His seat of power was the town of Pátzcuaro at the southern end of the lake of the same name, and he suffered to unify his people and arranged an alliance between the cities of Pátzcuaro, Ixhuatzio, and Tzintzuntzan, which are all considered capitals of the empire, which he also began rather violently expanding. He also forced his nephews to murder one of his own sons, named Kuratame, because he was too much of a drunk, so there's that too. This was all happening in an environment of fierce competition caused by rising lake levels in the region. Because of the medieval climate anomaly, lake levels had dropped, and the amount of arable and habitable land around the lakes nearly doubled between 900 and 1100. But then the lake levels rose to their current levels around 1300 because of an increase in precipitation, which cut back the amount of land the Purupecha had access to and stoked fierce competition between the several small polities that existed there at the time, which eventually resulted in Tariakuri's Huacusecha dynasty coming out on top. Tariakuri lived around 1325 or even as late as around 1450, sources differ. His successors expanded the empire further across Michoacan and beyond, and the capital eventually moved to Tzintzuntzan. But of course, it wasn't to last. Before I talk about their fall, I'm just going to speed run through some of the fascinating sites besides Tzintzuntzan that they left behind. There's Ixhuatzio on the southeastern arm of Lake Pátzcuaro, a sacred site which served as the empire's fortified country capital. It's sometimes hosted the court and also held the empire's treasury. Its most imposing features are these dual-step pyramids, as well as the elevated walkways flanking them, which are called huatziris. There are also 3 yakatas elsewhere in the site, but they're not open to the public. Unfortunately, part of one of the pyramids collapsed due to heavy rain late this July, which sort of made the rounds on Twitter. Something almost identical to this was thought to be an omen of the Spanish conquest, so maybe Mexico is about to be invaded by aliens. Then there's Angamuco, which was only found in 2007. LiDAR scanning, begun in 2011, shows that it once held 40,000 buildings and was even larger than nearby Tsinsunzan, since it covered 10 square miles. It even features its own Yukata, and it's barely been excavated, though the excavations that have taken place there revealed a post-classic cemetery containing amazing bronze and copper rattles, which still work apparently, but it peaked between 1000 and 1350, so right before the empire really took off. But there are also a bunch of really impressive classic period sites which sat within the Empire's territory but actually predate it. The most impressive of these is Tingambato, which is south of Lake Pátzcuaro and seems to have been heavily influenced by the grand central Mexican metropolis of Teotihuacan, which makes sense because people from Michoacan lived in it and were buried there. Another site in Michoacan named Tres Cerritos was also heavily influenced by Teotihuacan. It primarily features a bunch of low platforms, but a mask characteristic of Teotihuacan was found in a tomb there along with 2 decapitated skulls. I'm not sure if this is it, but this mask from another site in Michoacan named Guadalupe was 100% made in Teotihuacan. In the Purupecha Empire's time, the collapsed buildings and walls of Tres Cerritos were used as burial places for chiefs and their retainer sacrifices. And finally, there's Ixtepete in Jalisco and Zaragoza in northern Michoacan, which both roughly date to between 600 and 900 AD, so a bit later than the other two. Ixtepete shows some more Teotihuacan influence, and Zaragoza is thought to have possibly been inhabited by the Chichimecs. But that's enough of that. Let's see how the Purupecha Empire ended, which of course came as a result of the Spanish. The Purupecha had refused to aid their longtime rivals, the Aztecs, in fighting the Spanish, partially because of the perceived rudeness of the ambassadors they sent in either 1519 or 1520. These same ambassadors, or possibly spies sent to check out what was going on, also brought smallpox with them, which wound up killing the Kazanki at the time, a guy named Zuangua. As a result, the Aztec ambassadors were sacrificed, and Zuangua's ill-fated successor, Tongashuan II, chose to voluntarily submit to the Spanish, under the command of a conquistador named Cristobal de Olid. But he'd ordered 800 slaves to be slaughtered immediately beforehand because he didn't want them to defect to the Spanish, which sort of understandably freaked them the fuck out. This spurred Cristobal de Olid to destroy all the images of Curiaqueri in the city, and he seized all of Tongashuan's royal treasure. And to add more salt to the wound, he forced Tongashuan to deliver it to Cortez in person. Cortez then deliberately showed him the last Aztec Tlatoani, that guy we mentioned earlier, Cuauhtémoc, who he'd been torturing to sort of intimidate Tongashuan, I guess. And for the next few years, Tongashuan was periodically imprisoned in Mexico City and then released after ransoms were extorted from the Purupecha. He was also baptized in 1525 and given the name Francisco. At around the same time, Cortez began dividing Michoacan into encomiendas for his men, and the Purupecha were forced to mine silver for them and to supply them with huge amounts of tribute. Eventually, Tongashuan was either garroted or burnt alive on the banks of the Lerma River on Valentine's Day of 1530 by the person who succeeded Cortez as the head of New Spain, an especially ruthless Spanish lawyer named Nuno Beltran de Guzman. Guzman tried to justify Tongashuan's execution by trying him over accusations of sodomy and idolatry and of plotting against the expedition they were supposed to be jointly leading against West Mexico. But in reality, it was just the culmination of Guzman torturing him in an attempt at getting him to reveal all the gold he was thought to be hiding. It's sort of ironic because even before this, Guzman himself had been excommunicated for other atrocities he'd committed against the natives, and he had left Mexico City in the first place to avoid losing his position. But eventually he was arrested in 1536 and shipped back to Spain in chains. But Guzman's imprisonment came far too late though, and many of the Purupecha had fled to Michoacan's isolated highlands to avoid his wrath. The Spanish started calling the Purupecha the Tarascans, but that's actually derived from the Purupecha's word for the Spanish, which was Tarasqua or Tarasque. It's sort of a dark joke about their habit of taking advantage of their women because it means in-laws or brother-in-law. Despite how much suffering the Spanish had inflicted on the Purupecha nobles still held a lot of land and actually began organizing the construction of Michoacan's first Christian churches. For example, a non-royal Purupecha guy called Don Pedro Quinarangari testified against Tangashuan at his trial and then became the nominal governor of Michoacan. He even maintained his own army and built a convent at Tzintzuntzan in 1535. He's represented here on the frontispiece of a document known as the Relación de Michoacán, the most important source on the Purupecha Empire, which was created by a Franciscan friar and some native artists in Tzintzuntzan between 1539 and 1541. I'm sure you can tell that I used a bunch of different pictures from this book to illustrate this part of the video. Tangashuan's son became known as Don Francisco Tariacuri, and understandably became Don Pedro's rival. According to legend, Tangashuan also had a daughter named Princess Erendira, who fought valiantly against the Spanish with horses she had stolen from them, but she might not have actually existed. Partially due to the intervention of Catholic missionaries who made efforts to befriend the Purupecha, spearheaded by the first bishop of Michoacan, the Venerable Vasco de Quiroga, the tribute system was abolished and the Purupecha sort of recovered from the devastation wrought by de Guzman. Quiroga formed self-governing native communities guided by friars called Republicas de Indios, which were modeled after the ideas in Thomas More's book Utopia. Quiroga is very fondly remembered by the Purupecha even today, and he's still known as Tata or Papa. But even though he helped the Purupecha maintain some of their lands and traditions, 30% of the Purupecha population perished between 1520 and 1565. But despite the many hardships they've faced, they're still here. There are approximately 200,000 living Purupecha, and remarkably, 10,000 of them still exclusively speak Purupecha, and 100,000 of them speak both Spanish and Purupecha. But the numbers might be a bit lower now because they're from the 1999 census. But the Purupecha's origins are still under debate, and have been ever since the Spanish conquest. In fact, the Spanish were so interested in solving the mystery that they had the Purupecha depict their origins on a piece of linen called the Lienzo de Yuku Takato, which was rediscovered in the 1870s and describes the Purupecha arriving where they are now from a homeland far to the south, identified as Cuzco, Peru, possibly at the suggestion of Spanish interrogators who had just recently learnt about it. They supposedly traversed the Amazon jungle to get to the Orinoco Delta, and from there they got to Veracruz by hitching on the backs of sea turtles, so obviously it should be taken with a grain of salt. And if they did actually come from South America, they would have almost certainly come via the Pacific. Some other somewhat tenuous evidence has been cited as proof of their South American origins. For example, the custom-cut volcanic stone casings of the Yacatas, called Zanamu, and the way they interlock is theorized to be derived from Incan or Tiwanaku architecture, but that seems like a little bit of a stretch to me. They don't really look that much alike. But the distinctive spout-handled vessels they use to drink chocolate are actually pretty similar to the stirrup-handled pots of Peru, and it's been theorized that these pottery similarities go back as far as 1500 BC. It's also been theorized that they introduced metalworking into Mesoamerica around 800 AD when they're thought to have arrived. But number one, other evidence points to them already being there, and number two, if pottery styles had been shared between Mesoamerica and Peru for so long, why hadn't metalworking been introduced in the 1600 years between 800 AD and when it was developed in Peru around 800 BC. So ultimately, it's possible that the Purupecha came from South America, and the idea of South America and Mexico being connected that far back is really cool, but I don't really think the Purupecha are actually South American. I could be wrong though. Whew, I think that's the longest segment on any civilization I've done yet. So let's move further north up into the United States to cover our next entry, the Hohokam. The Hohokam are another extraordinary ancient Native American people who managed to flourish in the deserts of Arizona and a bit of northern Mexico for 1,000 years between 450 and 1450. They were mainly concentrated around the Salt and Gila rivers around modern Phoenix and the Santa Cruz River around modern Tucson. Since water's the one thing you need and the one thing you don't have enough of in a desert, their ability to manipulate the water from these rivers was the key to their success. But when they were no longer able to manage it effectively, their civilization collapsed. That's because the Hohokam made up for the lack of rain they received by building an enormous network of irrigation canals, which could be up to 45 meters wide. By the year 1300, they covered 110,000 acres, which means that they actually formed the biggest pre-Columbian irrigation network in the Americas besides the ones made in Peru. You can tell that they were made with a lot of care because they gradually descend down the landscape on a gradient of 1 to 2 feet per mile. The Hohokam were actually the only people in all of North America to rely on such an irrigation network, but because of that, they were able to maintain the largest population of any culture in the prehistoric American Southwest. The point of these canals was, of course, to irrigate their crops, which included maize, beans, squash, and cotton. Standard New World stuff. The cultivation of these crops started in Mexico, so some think that the Hohokam were originally from Mexico, which could explain some of their other close links to Mesoamerica, but they were probably just the descendants of local nomadic peoples. They adopted agriculture as early as around 2000 BC, and from then on they steadily became more and more sedentary. Beyond that, Hohokam civilization proper is divvied up into two main periods: the pre-classic period, which lasted from between 450 and 1150 AD, and the classic period, which lasted from 1150 to the collapse of Hohokam civilization around 1450. The pre-classic was when the Hohokam first began building their irrigation canals and their distinctive oval ball courts. It's also when they started creating their unique red-on-buff pottery, as well as these strange stone pallets. People generally lived in clusters of small single-room pit houses with a wooden core and thick mud walls facing a common courtyard, which probably represented where extended families lived together. People were also generally cremated and had their ashes buried in jars, along with little ceramic figurines of both people and animals. Cremations might have involved these odd stone pallets, which might have been used to create pyrotechnic displays symbolizing the entrance to the underworld, because it's possible that substances like lead were burnt on them to create colored fire. They could have also, of course, been used for sniffing hallucinogens. Hohokam sites generally have pretty good names, but the largest pre-classic site absolutely takes the cake because it's a place called Snaketown, and it was once home to as many as 2,000 people. Snaketown also features the largest known Hohokam ball court, which is 75 meters long, and apparently that's enough space for 500 onlookers. The Hohokam shared their love of ball courts with the civilizations of Mesoamerica, but Hohokam ball courts are different from the ones in Mesoamerica. Mesoamerican ball courts are eye-shaped, walled structures, while Hohokam ball courts are oval depressions, which also feature plastered floors and stone markers. The Hohokam used balls made of both rubber and stone, so I'm betting that more than a few Hohokam ball game players wound up with their skulls crushed. But they clearly loved these ball courts, since most of their large villages had more than one of them. And even though they had different types of ball courts, the Hohokam were definitely really closely tied to Mesoamerica, especially West Mexico. They imported tons of little copper bells from Michoacan, and they also imported other stuff from Mesoamerica, like pyrite mirrors bearing Mesoamerican designs, scarlet macaws, which they also could have gotten from the nearby city of Casas Grandes in Chihuahua, and even chocolate based on the presence of a substance left by cacao called theobromine being present in their pottery. They also really liked shell jewelry made out of seashells from the Gulf of California. Notably, some were decorated with acid. A design would be painted on a shell using resin, and then it would be dunked in the acidic juices of the saguaro cactus, which would eat away at all the bits left unprotected by the resin to eventually produce a raised relief. But everything, and I mean literally everything, dramatically changed in the succeeding classic period, defined as starting around 1150. They began living in walled apartment compounds consisting of fully above-ground adobe buildings. They began being buried instead of cremated. They stopped making those weird pallets. Contact with Mesoamerica diminished. The ball courts stopped being used. The quality of their pottery deteriorated, and most importantly, platform mounds surrounded by big walls, which were either used as temples or as elite residences, began to dominate the larger villages. Villages with these platform mounds were evenly spaced every 3 miles along the irrigation canal network, so whoever was in charge of them was also probably in charge of maintaining the canals. One of the best preserved platform mounds is at a site called Pueblo Grande near Phoenix. 2 doorways on the top were astronomically aligned in a way that made a beam of sunlight pass through them as the sun rose on the summer solstice, which I think is pretty cool. And the mound is also surrounded by a maze of rooms, including storage rooms and cooking areas that were probably used to support the elites living on top of it. But there's an even more impressive classic period site, Casa Grande. Its main feature is, of course, the Casa Grande, this big house here. It's a 4-story adobe structure that was probably constructed in the early 1300s. Several others like it once existed, but it's the only one left standing now. But the new elites of the classic period failed to fix whatever problems their creation was probably meant to solve, and Hohokam civilization collapsed by around 1450, which is also around when the Mississippian civilization further to the east in the states also collapsed, strangely enough. The exact reasons for this collapse remain unclear, but there are tons of competing theories attempting to explain it. It could have happened because of warfare, disease, an extreme drought, or maybe even the exact opposite, mass flooding. Tree ring and streamflow data seems to suggest that they had to repeatedly grapple with massive floods in the late 14th century, which might have ruined their canals. This was happening as the Southwest as a whole was becoming depopulated as the result of a really big drought. When I covered the ancestral Puebloans in part 1, I mentioned how this probably even led to cannibalism among them. So some of them might have migrated south to Hohokam lands and put so much strain on their resources that they just weren't able to cope with the natural disasters they were facing, and that led to major internal strife. The Akimel Oodam, also known as the Pima, have legends about defeating the Hohokam in battle and seizing their platform mounds after they'd grown too arrogant, so that might have been it. But maybe that's their memory of internal social unrest, because the Akimel Oodam are actually thought to be descendants of the Hohokam, along with other Oodam groups. I mean, the name sort of makes it obvious, doesn't it? The name Hohokam comes from their term Hohokam Oodam, which either means the finished people or just refers to ancestors. The Hopi of northern Arizona, the Yuma of southwestern Arizona, the Yavapai, and the Maricopa might also all be connected to the ancient Hohokam. So like most of the civilizations we covered today, the Hohokam aren't truly gone. Well, that's all for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this little trek through the ancient Americas. Now, I'd like to thank my esteemed patrons, Dhruv Singhal, Booga420, Bajun, Julia Erickson, Harrison Timperley, Doc Bossman, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tombadil, Danny Banani, Rose Klein, James Kirk, Alyssa P., Mark Elliott Cullen, Shemek Wierzbitsky, Jack Lester, Mithridates, Jake the Snake, Liv Buller, Tyler Doucette, Inbred Cat, Have a Cigar, Alex Clark, Jess Sullivan, Akune, John Ballard, Giovanna Lazzarini, Mark Krupnick, and Miha Nidog for their generous support. Stay tuned for part 3 of the Uparts Iceberg and maybe even a little video about some pharaohs.